right? And some examples of those is what I stepped through before. Was number one was youth culture. And I talked about that the youth culture's heroes were by and large anti-heroes and focused particularly on young Elvis Presley, rock and roll. Now recognize that term rock and roll is simply like Kleenex, it's a brand. The musical style that Elvis Presley was playing, Little Richard was playing, was called at the time rhythm and blues. But rhythm and blues was associated with African American artists. And white people didn't want to consume African American art. It was too radical, it was too crossing of boundaries. And so a DJ in Cleveland, why is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland? Because Alan Freed, a disc jockey in Cleveland, is going to coin it as rock and roll. So it's simply rebranding. Right? But I make this point, and some of these didn't play, yada yada, youth culture, the dance culture. It's not going to open. Is going to, in essence, focus on the way in which Elvis Presley is not adhering to these views of youth culture. Right? He's from the wrong side of the tracks. He's playing black music. He's sexually suggestive in his dress and in his dancing and all the rest of the stuff. The United States Senate of the superpower United States of America is going to investigate Elvis Presley. This is the Senate subcommittee. His performances are, quote, striptease acts with clothes on, not only suggestive but obscene. The Senate subcommittee is going to find that Elvis Presley is only a symbol, of course, but a dangerous symbol. His striptease antics threaten to rock and roll the juvenile world into open revolt against society. The gangster of tomorrow is the Elvis Presley of today. Right? Now, that gangster reference is sort of an interesting one. Right? What you've got is this question of why the hell is the U.S. Senate investigating rock and roll as a component of it? Right? Because what they're looking at here is a reflection of youth culture that is pushing up against older people and saying, no, we're not going to behave that way. That's not who we are. Those aren't our values. Right? And those values, as Americans, are generally seen as a very positive trait of being an American citizen. Right? To hell with you, I'm going to do what I want to. If that's conservative or liberal or whatever the hell it is, I, as an American, have the freedom to be able to do that. Right? And if it sounds familiar, and it bleeds into the next lecture that we're going to be talking about modern civil rights movement, in the 1990s, the Senate investigated hip-hop. They investigated rap, gangster rap. Oh my God, this music is going to turn everyone into gangsters. Well, it did get young guys to pull their jeans down to about their ass, right? People wear their clothes a lot differently. But for the most part, it is a reflection of their culture. It is a reflection of what they do and how they enjoy and how they separate themselves, right, from an older generation. Again, as a cultural historian, if you're interested about this stuff, sign this great book, relatively small, All Shook Up, How Rock and Roll Changed America. It focuses specifically on the 1950s, and it talks about this notion of what rock and roll does is to break down these barriers between race and gender and sexuality, etc. It is not welcomed. It is investigated by the Senate. It's told by society, there's something wrong with you. Good kids don't listen to rock and roll, which is a joke today, right? And the same thing is true if you're interested in hip hop. So there's a great book called Can't Stop, Won't Stop. Jeff Chang wrote this, called The History of the Hip Hop Generation. It focuses on the 1980s and 1990s. Hip hop does the exact same thing, right? It forces, no one is paying attention to inner city African Americans. These people are just being left behind. And their musical expression, their cultural expression is going to be angry, it's going to be direct, it's going to be, I'm not going to play by your rules. I'm going to take words that you use against me, the N-word, and I'm going to use it as a positive assumption for myself, right? This is normal. This is typical behavior by Americans. This is a healthy sign of our society saying, old people, this is how you say we're supposed to act, but this is how we're going to act. Not we're going to go back to when we all agreed, because you're never going to find that in American history. Right? So example number one, and one that we're going to come back to in a big way in the 1960s, is that youth culture is not feeling as if everyone agrees on everything. They all want to dress like Wonky in their khaki pants. Again, with khaki pants, right? They want to dress like the old people. They want to talk like the old people. They don't, and they never have, right? Example number two, this is what I stopped at last time, was sexual liberation. The idea of sexuality is not new. Right? There's always an uncomfortableness in terms of dealing with, where does sexuality is, there's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing that is anything, homosexuality, whatever, all that kind of stuff. What you have in the 1950s is an assumption that sexuality is not to be discussed or talked about. right? That it doesn't exist. Where do babies come from? The stork brings them, of course, right? Mom and dad didn't do anything. They're just going to have this kind of public display of affection. And particularly for women. Young men can, well, they're going to sow their wild oats, all that kind of stuff. But for young women, their sexuality is seen as dangerous. And again, those movies of the 1950s, very often the femme fatale, the reason why the man goes astray in a film is because he runs into a woman who is sexually active, right? She is going to use her sexual wiles. She's going to use her sexuality as a tool to either control men or, vamping them, taking their strength, et cetera, et cetera. That's the assumption. That's what everyone, quote unquote, agrees on. When you look at the 1950s, however, right, you see a very different way in which people are acting. Sexuality in music, as I already talked about, is much more open. Sexuality in films is becoming much more available and open. Ideas like pornography, sexually explicit movies are becoming centrally available in the United States. Playboy magazine, this old duffer who thinks he's gone on, right? Hugh Hefner is going to start a magazine, a men's magazine, that is going to specifically focus on sexuality as the lead-in for the magazine itself. It becomes a national sensation. This guy over on the right, I said a picture of Marilyn Monroe, right? This sort of sex kitten, sex object. He's a huge star in the 1950s. Alfred Kinsey is an academic, teaches at Indiana University. He originally starts as an entomologist, studies bugs. I find it ironic he studies wasps, right? But not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, little bugs, right? He is going to commission a study on human sexuality. And he is going to, in his 2 reports, look at over 18,000 on the first one, the behavior of the male, 18,000 full-length interviews, and for women, 23,000 full-length interviews. I'll come back to that. These are national bestsellers. Both books are over on the shelves in the Bill Library, by the way. And what are they? They are asking people about their sexual practices. And what do you find? I have to read some of this. You'll see in a second why I have to read them, right? Number 1, 68, 2/3 of men, 1/2 of women have engaged in premarital intercourse, right? 2/3 of men, half of women have had sex before marriage. I always say, mom and dad get on your case, so I always say, if you don't plan on getting married, it's not premarital intercourse, right? So, there's a legal edge, there's a legal argument to be made there, right? So this idea of we're waiting for marriage is the minority. Number 2, half of men in marriage and a quarter of women in marriage have committed adultery, right? So the institution of marriage is not sanctified in that regard. Now we get a little dicier. 37% of men and 13% of women report at least one homosexual encounter, with over 14% of men being exclusively, at least in this study, reporting being exclusively homosexual. That number is high, and for reasons which I'll get to in just a second, but it also indicates the fact that homosexuality has always been a presence in society. Go back to ancient times, for God's sakes. This is not something that is a disease or caused by way in which people are raised, or the clothing they wear, or the dolls they play with. It is a prevalent factor of American society. Last one again, why I have to read this. 8% of men and 4% of women report of having, at some point in time, sex with an animal. Right? I'm just reporting here. It's not in the book, right? Kinsey's studies are national bestsellers. Why? Because people are interested in this, right? Why were those numbers the way they were, right? One of the elements I would report is that his reporting is coming from, a lot of times they're from prison populations, sex-segregated prison populations. And so the incidence of homosexuality is higher when you only have men, you only have women, right? The second thing is that he is going to report on people who are willing to talk about their sexuality, right? If they, he and his grad students knock on my dad's door, what position, what are you talking about? Sneaky punch in the nose, right? Shut up, get the hell out of here, you creep, right? Not everyone is comfortable about talking about sexuality or their own sexuality, and as a result, he's going to get people who are more inclined to talk about that, right? So there's inflated, certainly the incidence of homosexuality is a bit inflated because of that. But what you can say is that this is a country of PDA. This is a country where it doesn't, we don't talk about that. We don't do that. You can just look at the data. You're talking 35,000 interviews. It's pretty substantial. In the 1940s and 1950s, there's a lot of whoopee going on, right? This is another example of conforming. not consensus. Being told good girls do this, good boys do that, right? Not in terms of their behavior. Example number 3, women. I always love this kind of graphic. Whatever happened to Rosie the Riveter? Many of you, when talking about World War II, the good war, civil rights movement, focused on the demonstration that women were able to apply in World War II of being equal to just about any task. Right? They're not going to be the middle linebacker for the Dallas Cowboys, but they can do most jobs. And this image here of Rosie the Riveter doing that job, and then kind of superimposed, oh, well, she'll go home. She'll be a housewife. She will no longer be an independent individual. She will serve her husband. She will serve her children. Back when my mom was still alive, I went to the source and I asked my mom, because first she was a stay-at-home mom in the 1950s. Did you enjoy it? She said, yeah, no, I enjoyed it. I liked it. You know, my dad made enough money in the 50s where he could stay home, she could stay home, she could raise us. I always laugh when I got old enough, she went back to work, right? So we were back to, it was like, you know, they had enough of me. You know, my sister and I grew up in a kind of traditional home. There isn't an assumption that either staying at home or working is good or wrong, good or bad. But the assumption that's going to be picked up in the 1950s is that women should define themselves this way. A successful woman is married. An unsuccessful woman is single. Right? A successful woman is going to make her husband more successful, is going to raise children. Right? An unsuccessful, something's wrong with them if they want. A number of movies in the 1950s kind of had these female characters who chose career over family, and it all ends in destruction. Right? You know, usually their kids are dead or she's in prison or some such thing. And while it's delayed in a sense of when it takes place, Betty Friedan is going to be studying this. Betty Friedan is going to be writing about her experiences in the 1950s. She goes to an all-girls college, she studies sociology, she wants to, like any graduate, I'm going to go and change the world or do whatever, my corner of the world, I'm going to make a difference. What she does once she graduates is that she gets a lot of pressure from her mom and dad to get married. She marries a man who she loves, but she's not, you know, crazy about. She has children. Her career gets put on the sideline. She gets depressed. She goes to the doctor. The doctor says, well, here's some amphetamines. I'll pick you right up, right? I can't sleep. Oh, here's some sleeping pills. Put you right down. Right? And what you see is this kind of culture that she gets put into where she's frustrated by her own choices, but also the choices that seem to be, quote unquote, the right ones for a woman to make. And 10 years later, she is invited back to her alma mater for a renewal, right? Or whatever it is. It's like a high school reunion, a reunion of the graduates. And she's terrified. She writes about it. She's terrified about going to that. Because clearly all the girls that she goes to school with have done the same, have done what she was unable to do. Here she is, dependent on prescription drugs and feeling bad about herself and, basically internalizing all this. I'm the problem. She goes to this reunion, what does she find? 90% of the women that are there, all of them, graduates, all these dreams of the future, 90% of them have the same phenomenon take place. She's writing about this experience in the 1950s and 1963. The book's called Feminine Mystique, and it's going to open up this conversation of, well, maybe your assumption of what a real woman should do, right? Everyone can have a view of what a woman or a man should do. It's your view. It's not mine. It's not the person sitting next to you. You have no reasonable right to be able to say, well, by God, this is what you should do. Right? Those are cultural distinctions. It's like a religious practice. You don't have any right to say what someone else should or shouldn't do in regards to their religion. Right? But in this case, we're talking about gender identification. Right? What you do see in the 50s are these kinds of images that you're seeing. Maiden form, so happy driving and topless with a bra. And the bra is making me free. And by the way, if you're Christian Dior, and I see the Dior logo, Christian Dior emerges in the 1950s with this sort of Audrey Hepburn, little schoolgirl kind of look, right? So it doesn't look like necessarily an adult as much as it is a young girl, Madeline kind of thing. My favorite is the everybody's getting their Christmas presents down here, and what does mom get? Oh, you got a vacuum, right? Believe me, I take it from a guy who's been married for 35 years. Do not give your wife a vacuum for Christmas, right? I mean, it doesn't work out, right? I would not think it would work out. Okay? So in example number 3, in terms of not saying, in essence, one way's right or one way's wrong, but clearly saying that this idea that everyone agrees on these issues is wrong. What's different is that it's just starting to gain expression. It is going to require what? It is going to require a group of people who are going to be willing and able to push back against it. That's called the baby boom, right? When we get to the 60s, these issues are all going to bubble to the surface. Lastly is this notion of consumerism. The assumption is, and I've made this point way back in the class, the American dream is alive and well. You'll hear critics, oh, American dream, blah, blah. American dream is a work dream. American dream is I can control my money, I control my impulses, I can do what I need to do. You being in class today is a pretty good indicator of your ability to control your own American dream. My guess is that there are other places you could be that you would be having much more fun. But you're not doing that. Why? Because you know that this will make it easier for you to pass the final, and that this in the final will increase your GPA, and increasing your GPA will get you graduated from college, yada, yada, right? That's the American dream. The American way of life, right? That I demand $1 a gallon gasoline, that I demand to have supersize, that I demand to have. The American way of life is a consumer argument, right? Again, today's book day for Blondie. Conquest of Cool, which I'll come back to in the 1950s. One of my research focuses is on consumer culture in general. By the time we get to the 1960s, they're going to be wrapping in all of this counterculture idea. But the idea is that marketing madmen, right, are going to be all over this, and in essence, positioning consumer culture as happiness, right? How do you know you're happy? Because I got a car. I got the car I want. I got a Buick instead of a Ford. I got or General Motors. I got a Mercedes-Benz instead of a Cadillac or whatever. I'm happy because of some item that I'm able to consume, right? But you see, again, it may be fine. The interesting thing there you see this in fast food in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. When I was growing up, first of all, you could get an entire meal for $1, right? I mean, it wasn't growing up in the Great Depression. But you'd have a hamburger, you'd have a small serving of fries, and you'd have a small Coke. More than enough to feed you, right? More than enough for lunch. You have to order literally, because they do it, have to order up the kids' menu to get those portion sizes today. Now it's supersized. Now it's 50 million because it's cheap and it's an easy way with sugar and all that kind of stuff, corn syrup, to be able to give a sense of satisfaction. Is that really what it means to be an American? Supersized Coke, right? I get a supersized this or something? Or is it more fundamental about freedom, about constitutional rights, about being able to do whatever you want to do as long as you're not taking somebody else's freedoms away? This is the argument that's going to be made in the 1950s. Right? That everyone agrees that consumerism is the be-all and end-all to American society. I focus there on televisions in the suburbs in particular because of the fact that what you've got is a very different way in which your television, these ideas and images are going to be presented to people. They're going to come right into the home. And you guys have phones, and the same thing with me. It's that you can't go 2 minutes without something coming, some spam coming on your phone. Right? So we're inundated by it. In 2022, right, you see thousands of messages of consumerism that we just are pretty good at ignoring, right? In the 1950s, consumerism was sort of limited to if you were out at the store, or if you were reading a magazine and saw ads or the newspaper or billboards or something like that. What does TV do? TV brings us right into the home. Kids are sitting there watching Howdy Doody. Let's have a break for Hershey syrup or something like here. Here's the new milk. That this comes as a component of free television. It's not free, right? If we were to get to social media, that's always one of my favorite lines, is that if you don't have to pay for something on the internet, and you're like, hey, I don't have to pay for this, you are the product. You are what's being sold, right? So just by doing those things, why is Google and all those so valuable? Because they're recording every keystroke. Who you are, what you're consuming. Same as your television. Right? It's doing it more passively. There isn't but what you're watching and what you're responding to in terms of advertising. Suburbanization is the kind of flip side of that. Right? So if this is the consensus view, then how do you explain a large group of young people, now not large enough yet, who are going to reject this? They call themselves the Beats, right? It's a reference, but it's a reference to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus of Nazareth, the Beatitudes, right? Beatitudes, so it's not beat like that kind of thing. It's Beatitudes, how to live your life. Right? Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek in spirit, blessed are the humble, and so those are beatitudes. Those are assumptions about a healthy and moral life. And the Beats are going to say, in essence, the same thing is true with consumer culture. Is that why the hell are you going to let someone else tell you to be cool, I have to have a such and such logo. To be cool, I have to be told by somebody else that I'm following along with the pack. Right? To be valued, I have to have the latest phone. The Beats are going to push back against this. And the same thing is true with pop art. So Andy Warhol in the 1950s, it's always hard to get a sense of Warhol's influence. But Warhol is silk screening his art. Meaning what? You look around the room and a lot of t-shirts have silk screening on it. It's not some Michelangelo individually painting every one of his images. He's mass producing them. And artists are artists, or I should say notable artists are notable because they're just a little bit ahead of the rest of us. They just have a sense of what's going on. They have their antennas up, right? That's what makes it noteworthy. And what Warhol is kind of saying here, both with Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe, oh, you think Marilyn's sexy? Great, I'm gonna make her hair even blonder. I'm gonna make her boobs even bigger. I'm gonna make her lips even redder. And she almost looks absurd, and the same thing with Elvis Presley. And that's the idea, is that what you're being sold is in essence something that if you take it to its logical expression, is absurdity. It's, well, I guess I didn't want more. You know, I mean, it's like you go in and get supersized French fries. You gotta walk out with 300 French fries or something like that. These Beats are going to, in essence, say that by defining ourselves by goods, we're hamsters getting on a wheel. Because the next thing we want is the bigger product, right? What makes you happy? Is it a good? Is it a service? Is it, there's nothing wrong with a good car. There's nothing wrong with, with being able to have those kind of material goals. But again, when we come back to the 60s, I'm talking about with this book, Madison Avenue is all over this. They see this. And they see it as not a weakness, but an opportunity, a business opportunity, particularly in America, where we have that sense of, I can redefine myself in all these different ways. Okay? So what are we left with here? What we're left with is, in essence, or at least my argument, is that consensus exists. There is this World War II, post-World War II consensus. The good war means something to the American public. They're proud of it. They're proud of fighting the Cold War. What's going on in regards to Vietnam and Korea, at least in the early days of Vietnam, right? Fear of communism, a dislike of communism, we don't want communism in Texas, we don't want it in Corpus Christi, all valid. And scratch the surface of most people and they would have the same values. One of the things I mentioned when doing these Pew studies is that if you do find yourself in an environment where you're around people who have racist tendencies or bigoted tendencies, I would challenge you to go look at some of the race-based issues on the Pew site. And very much like in 1945, what you find is race is meaningless when it comes to people's values. Region, age, religion, those are a hell of a lot more powerful. But you sure as hell don't have any kind of race-based, this is what people think. So I'm not arguing in essence that consensus doesn't exist. There is an element of consensus. But conformity is the dominant perspective of these four examples. This idea of being forced into something. And a lot of the early 1960s, before you get to the counterculture, before you get to the hippies, right, is a focus on that. If you see the movie The Graduate, right, Dustin Hoffman, really interesting movie. Again, perfect movie at your age. It's that same notion of saying, here's what adults are telling me what to do. Why are they telling me that? Why? I'm talking to my youngest son later on Thursday, I guess that's tomorrow, right? He already knows that while I'll be talking, have you thought about this and that and the other stuff? I'm looking at it as a father trying to give advice to a son who's kind of finding his way in Pittsburgh and yada yada. He and his wife are going through. That's not his life, right? He's the one that's got to live with those decisions. He's the one that's got to make value of that. You can't be told because of an advertisement, this is how you should be, this is what you should look like, this is what sexy is, right? And the body image kind of component of that. These social pressures are going to build. And they're going to become much more focused. The reason why I led with youth culture is because young people have inherently this notion of saying, to be independent, I kind of have to push back against mom and dad, right? Go back to high school, right? And it's like, part of that is kind of finding where the boundaries are. Young people are naturally going to push those boundaries. When you have a baby boom, when you have this explosion in the 1960s of the children from this era, they're going to, in essence, do this. This is when we get to the counterculture, when we get to the hippies. What are they countering? Right? Everyone knows the counterculture, that. The key word is counter. What they're arguing is that the 50s are a weird decade where everybody says we're all the same. We're not. We never have been. We've never assumed that. The 50s do assume that. And it's largely created as a result of this. It begs the question, the 50s are in many ways the most un-American, and I don't mean, the communists or something like that, but the most atypical decade of the modern era. And yet at the same time are often held up as this exemplary of what American society should be. And there's this weird dynamic that we are going to be continuing to kind of fight according to that. Right? So what I wanted to do with this section was to kind of set up this notion that the post-World War II, we talked about foreign policy, we talked about how Vietnam sort of blows up in the face of Lyndon Johnson. What's going on is a cultural realignment, right? And it's going to really ask these kind of fundamental questions of, if you are a free American citizen, can you not do what you want to, assuming you don't take somebody else's freedom away, right? That's the one caveat, right? You can't fire in a crowded building because you will kill more people than sin, right? That issue is one I didn't want to get lost because we're kind of speeding along with the rest of the narrative. All right, questions about that? Content, and then I want to pick up here another subject. All right, so you'll find that lecture, it's called The Domestic Cold War, and there's a second half to it, you can see it or not see it. We'll kind of come back to the politics of this later on, certainly when we get to the 1960s. All right, so what I want to do is to switch over to what is a major topic for this final section. 500 years from now, when people talk about the United States in the 20th century, I guarantee you they're going to talk about two things, many more probably, the World War II and the modern civil rights movement. Right? I'll bet you. Right? You can hold me to it 500 years from now. These are both major elements within the United States during the 20th century. And what separates the modern civil rights movement, and when I talk about modern, again, that word is sort of awkward. What does that mean? New and improved, whatever. It's largely post-World War II civil rights movement. And the reason is because World War II is going to have such an impact on the United States and the way in which we define ourselves. And the central question kind of comes out of this is, what's happening in the modern civil rights movement? And there's a writer who I'm going to get back to in just a second, James Baldwin, African-American, happens to be homosexual, but obviously in the 1960s, or 50s and 60s, not a good thing. He's a playwright. He is good friends with Martin Luther King. He's good friends with Malcolm X. He's connected to the modern civil rights movement for African Americans. He is going to be able to articulate, because he's a writer, a lot of the central themes. And the one that I'm going to keep coming back to is here, and it's one where you kind of have to slow down and get your head around. If I'm not who you say I am, then you're not what you think you are, right? Meaning what? Meaning on the first day of class, when I walked into class, it was easier when I used to have long hair, and I used to have ponytail, right? So it was, when I walked into class, you didn't know me, you hadn't taken a class from me, you may have somebody else you knew who took a class from me, but you immediately said, here's who he is, here's what he stands for, here's his value. I did the same thing to you. Oh, well, there's someone sitting in the front, or someone sitting in the back, or someone, not pejoratively, not negatively. We don't, hopefully, are just make first impressions. We're not like preschoolers and no, he's a bad man, right? But you project. You have this sense of what you are based on what others around you are. What Baldwin is saying here is, in essence, is that racial ideology, and particularly a superior, one's better than the other. It's one thing to kind of assume that race, which is a social construct, exists. It doesn't. But to see one as better, one's more supreme, white supremacy, black supremacy, orange supremacy, whatever color supremacy, is more about the person who holds that value than the person themselves. Right? And so in essence, put this back in racial, if a black person is not what you say they are, then what it is taking away the value you hold for yourself of superiority. That's the problem of the modern civil rights movement, right? So Baldwin, in this, another one of those, I'm going to jump out here real quick. Baldwin's going to talk to this. This is 1968. I would argue one of the worst is kind of one of the hardest years in American history. We get there. We already know what Vietnam is going on, right? But it is one of the periods of time where I was 7 years old. I don't remember this feeling because I was 7 years old, but it is as if every one of the wheels in this country are coming off. And nothing seems to be working. And so he is speaking within the pressure of race riots, in this case race riots, assassinations, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, right, in 1968. And and he is going to be talking within that context. You're going to see that in terms of his bearing. But he's in essence making this argument in a different setting.
I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means that you agree that human life is an academic matter. So I'm forced to be an optimist. I'm forced to believe that we can survive, that we must survive. But the Negro in this country, the future of the Negro in this country is precisely as bright or as dark as the future of the country. It is entirely up to the American people and our representatives. It is entirely up to the American people whether or not they're going to face and deal with and embrace this stranger whom they've allowed so long. What white people have to do is try to find out in their own hearts why it was necessary to have a nigger in the first place. Because I'm not a nigger, I'm a man. But if you think I'm a nigger, it means you need it. The question you've got to ask yourself, the white population of this country's got to ask itself, North and South, because it's one country, and for a Negro, there is no difference in North and the South. There's just a difference in the way they castrate you. But the fact of the castration is the American fact. And I'm not the nigger here. And you invented it, and you, the white people, invented it. And you got to find out why. And the future of the country depends on that, whether or not it's able to ask that question.
For what it's worth, I completely agree with him, right? And the ability to have that conversation about race, about why the hell this matters, why it's useful, in large part is a question of American society coming to terms with the ability to have that conversation. We haven't had a great track record on that, right? Recently, right? Don't want to talk about it. Don't want to discuss it. In large part, in essence, that's the element that's going on there. It's not all negative, however. So again, Chris Rock has been in the news recently for other reasons, the slap and the Academy Awards. He used to have a TV show on HBO. I'm a big Chris Rock fan. I think he's very funny. I like his stand-up, et cetera, et cetera. This is being done in the kind of wake of the two murders, Biggie Smalls and Tupac Shakur, right? And it is also in the somewhere down here. Is also in the environment where you've had kind of racial incidents in and around New York City. Queens, which is just east of New York, had an incident where a couple of African American, they happened to be literally African kids, their car broke down, they were beaten, one was killed, right? And in that environment, she's asking this question: is it possible for white society to make that, to have that awareness and to be able to say, you know what, it's just culture, it's just music, it's just skin tone, it's all that kind of stuff. Rock does this within the context of humor. I always find humor to be very effective in regards to that, so keep in mind these are jokes. Keep in mind that his language, it would cost him $1 if you're gonna hear what you're gonna hear. But he's asking that same kind of question in a very different way of what James Baldwin just asked. So.
Every black neighborhood has a Martin Luther King Boulevard or a Malcolm X Boulevard. But there's never been a street named after a slain black icon in a white neighborhood. So what I did, I went to Howard Beach to see if I could get people to sign a petition to rename one of their greatest streets into Tupac Shakur Boulevard. In fact, look at the square.
Telling me that he stinks, his music stinks, and I'm not interested in having this boulevard's name changed to a piece of dirt like him.
Here's up. I got you.
What the fuck are you doing?
He's not a cop.
Have a good day.
Cop show.
Enjoy. Any problems with us now?
They're trying to change a Cross Bay Boulevard into a Tupac Shakur Boulevard. To a Tupac Shakur Boulevard. Why?
He wants to change Cross Bay into Tupac Shakur Boulevard. Into Tupac Shakur Boulevard. Into Tupac.
But he's dead. He should have died before he was born.
Are you familiar with Tupac? California. We're trying to change Crossway Boulevard into Tupac Shakur Boulevard.
I don't want to sign it. Sorry. And I liked him. It's a good entertainer.
I like you. Tupac I didn't care for.
Have you ever heard any of Tupac's music? You don't feel that?
I want to hear it.
Come on, pop your head.
I think you got some pair of claws that come down and they go like this.
How about Bruce Springsteen Boulevard?
No.
How about Neil Diamond Boulevard?
No.
Eric Clapton Boulevard?
Do you remember Olivia Newton-John?
Olivia Newton-John.
Frank Sinatra.
What if it was Frank Sinatra Boulevard?
That'd be a different story. But it's not my price.
Well, I think we're gonna change the street now.
Great. Let's change the name.
Oh, what the hell?
Yeah, we're almost there.
Humor, in this sense, is saying the same thing that Baldwin said. An important point I'll come back to. There's no one better or worse in their cultural perceptions there of saying I won't change it versus I will change it. The show kind of presents, oh, they're heroic for changing the show. There's no value, yes or no. I don't want to like the idea that someone can change it though is making an argument that they're not tied to a name or a sense of superiority. And if you'll notice, most of them are young, one veteran, right? Veterans also know that because they know who they serve with. And that's the ticking aspect of this, where older people are, oh, we're gonna set the clock back. That doesn't happen in history. If you'll notice, I only teach historically in one direction. We don't go in the other direction, because it doesn't work that way, right? This is the element that, in essence, you're looking at in American society, which has traditionally done this, right? Again, if you are white, if you are Pinky Beach, 100 years ago, there was no such thing as a white person. There was a German American, an Irish American, an Italian American, there were Catholics, there were Jews. You were identified by much more finely graded elements. And depending on who you were separated by that. They changed, right? The notion changes. Race will change as well, right? Race, interracial marriages and whatnot, and children from that. It's meaningless, and it's going to become increasingly meaningless in the United States. The biggest problem we have in 2022 is seeing where the United States was in 1945, right? That is a society that is completely segregated. This is George Wallace barring James Meredith's entry into the University of Alabama. James Meredith's parents had paid taxes in the state of Alabama. James Meredith paid taxes in the state. This is a public institution. You have the grades to get in, but no, you can't provide water fountains, segregation in that regard. What we tend to do is to identify with these events and see the outrage, right? And, oh, yay, someone's signing the petition. These are young people who are trying to, in essence, exert their First Amendment rights to be able to peacefully congregate and protest, and are being, summarily getting the shit kicked out of them by state officials and local officials, right? This one always sticks in my mind. These are college students who are part of the sit-in program. Segregation, this is after Brown v. Board says you cannot segregate, you cannot legally segregate in public facilities, right? Are sitting in at lunch counters. They are effectively boycotting, not allowing someone. And non-violently, peacefully, not throwing bombs, not marching downtown, and that kind of stuff. Sitting there and in essence taking the physical abuse. Here's Baldwin's, this image captures the sense of what Baldwin is talking about, right? And I'm always drawn to that old son of a bitch up in the upper left, right? He should know better. right? Young dudes who are just like, I'll show how tough I am. At least there's an excuse there, testosterone, right? But what you see clearly is that sense of a crowd mentality saying, I am better than you because I can do this to you, and no one can stop me. That's what Baldwin's talking about, right? And then every American who has any value in the Constitution is look at this and go, this is unacceptable, this is unallowable. And World War II forces that issue into the American public's kind of consciousness. So before 1954, and I'll get back to 54 in a second, that's the Brown v. Board, really, right? The United States is no different than South Africa was. We had apartheid, we had separate, separate but equal kind of assumptions. We had different racial categorizations in education, in medicine, and just about everything. Our sporting events were segregated. Baseball had 2 separate leagues, right? So if you're a baseball fan, we'll get back to that in just a second. Plessy versus Ferguson, you can go down the list, right? It is not simply based on African Americans or one particular group. It is, in essence, this idea of whiteness as being superior within the culture of the United States. Not legally, but within the culture. And that culture, what Plessy says, if you remember, what Plessy says is that because the American culture is dominated by basically white superiority, the Constitution can't change that. The Constitution can't do anything about it. And what all we can do is hope for is to have this apartheid system in the United States. That ain't the world that you were born into. And I kind of was, right? 61. It was still Chicago, big city of neighborhoods, quote unquote. Meaning what? Here's where blacks lived, here's where Hispanics lived, here's where whites lived. And it wasn't just whites, it was a certain ethnic. Here's where Ukrainians lived, here's where Poles lived, here's where the Irish lived. Right? What changes? A couple of things, right? And some of them are more important than others. Progressivism, not as a movement, not progressive, that kind of stuff, but the concept behind, going back to progressivism, that the differences between people are not because of melanin content in skin, because of the environmental realities in which they face, right? How good is their education? How good are their housing? How good is the food? How are they being treated in terms of society? You can treat people equally and they will grow up, in a sense, under the same set of rules. Progressivism kind of focuses these ideas in saying the United States can be critical of itself. We can try and improve things if we see, using evidence, right? We can try and test things. We can try and have that kind of pragmatic. The big one, at least in my argument, is the Second World War. Second World War is fighting against, Nazi, the same flag you see in white national. Again, my mind shuts down. I would love to have seen my uncle's reactions who fought in World War II to see these nabobs walking around with Nazi flags, right? My reaction tends to be the ones the Blues Brothers had, if you've ever seen the Blues Brothers, run them down on that. But this idea of racial separation, racial ideology as being something that is just simply un-American, right? Just in its very core. There's nothing wrong about being a bigot. I mean, personal preference aside, there's nothing illegal, let me put that way, about being a bigot. But being a racist, having power over someone else, that is unconstitutional, right? And we saw the Double V campaign during World War II kind of start this argument. The grassroots activism is what's different here. Is that unlike the progressive era, which had the NAACP, unlike other institutions where you would have to go to the White House and get power and money and what have you, what we're going to see here is a grassroots movement. Everyday individuals who are going to say, I'm just not willing to allow this to continue. And we get to Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and the others. They've grown in stature over the years, but they're everyday people, right, who are just saying, I ain't doing this anymore. And I am going to face the consequences. I will go to jail. I will have a record. Right? Martin Luther King gets arrested 19 times. Right? That's that component of it. And shout out to capitalism. Capitalism lifts hardworking people, right? And what you see is the African American population ahead of other minority groups because of reasons I've talked about before, not because better or anything like that, but just size and priority and all the rest of that stuff, are going to start being successful with economics, with money themselves. They're going to become affluent, right? Even today, the perception that you have of minorities is poverty. That is not the case. The most likely, if you want to paint a picture of the poverty in the United States, of who are the poorest and least educated people in this country, the image that should come to your mind statistically is a white pregnant girl, woman. right? A white woman, right? Those are the people who are going to be the most disadvantaged and the most capable of kind of having to do it. All right, I'll stop there, pick this up again.